Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating chronological journey through history to trace the immense arc of India's evolution. We're going to look at human development, how everyday people lived, struggled, and grew as the nation transformed from a colonial agrarian society burdened by imperial rule all the way into an independent, democratic republic. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at colonialism and the countryside, the colonial cities, Gandhi and the nationalist movement, the tragedy of partition, and finally, framing the Constitution. All right, starting off with Section 1, Colonialism and the Countryside. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the story behind the Burdwan Palace you see here. Back in 1797, there was a massive public auction to sell off the Raja of Burdwan's estates to pay his colonial tax debts. But the British collectors soon discovered a pretty brilliant twist. Over 95% of those sales were completely fictitious. The Raja's own servants had secretly outbid everyone else just to buy the lands back for him. It was a covert, super clever strategy to bypass those oppressive demands and keep local resources in local hands. And the whole reason the Raja had to resort to such extreme measures was because of brutal policies like the Sunset Law. The British demanded absolute punctuality. Basically, if a zamindar, which is a local landlord, didn't pay their fixed revenue by the exact sunset of a specified date, their entire estate could be auctioned off to the highest bidder. No exceptions. This wasn't just a simple tax law. It fundamentally altered the social hierarchy and absolutely crippled local upward mobility. So while the traditional zamindars were facing this crisis and losing their lands, a new class was rapidly rising, completely shifting local power dynamics. These were the jotedars, a class of rich peasants who were consolidating vast areas of land. Now, unlike the zamindars who lived in towns, jotedars lived directly in the villages. They controlled local trade, became moneylenders, and wielded immense direct power over the poor cultivators, who were known as ryots. So wealth and influence simply transferred from one native class to another, which honestly often increased the exploitation of the poorest farmers. And this brilliantly illustrates the colonial strategy of manipulating local populations for economic gain. Here, we're comparing two indigenous groups. On top, we have the Paharias, who lived in the Raj Mahal Hills and were intimately tied to the forest. They fiercely resisted the plow and straight up refused to clear the woods for settled agriculture. Because they were deemed uncooperative, the British intentionally brought in a completely different group, the Santals. The Santals were invited in specifically to clear the forests, subjugate the land, and expand revenue-generating agriculture. This essentially displaced the Paharias deeper into the barren hills. You can actually see the visual reality of that policy right here in this historical sketch. Forests were cleared, traditional ways of life were completely uprooted, and native groups were pitted against one another for land. The environmental and human cost of maximizing these revenues was absolutely devastating to indigenous communities in their development. Let's move on to Section 2, the colonial cities. Shifting our focus from the countryside to urban centers, the growth of colonial cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras wasn't just about constructing new buildings. It was a total restructuring of daily life, human development, and public rules. As the urban population swelled, the British realized they needed permanent, public rules to regulate health and how spaces were used. The city essentially became a laboratory for codifying behavior and managing society. Just look at this incredible quote from Lord Wellesley in 1803. He declared, "It is a primary duty of government to provide for the health, safety, and convenience of the inhabitants of this great town." He mandated comprehensive systems for roads, drains, watercourses, and permanent rules for construction. This is a massive shift in governance, right? Public health, sanitation, and town planning became codified responsibilities of the state. It was a major, albeit strictly regulated, step in improving urban living standards. But it wasn't just grand town planning. Architecture actually dictated everyday social relations. Take the famous Bombay Chawls. These were multi-storied buildings made up of single-room apartments built around a central shared courtyard. Because multiple families had to share these incredibly tight common spaces, it birthed entirely new forms of neighborhood identity. Despite the poor conditions, it fostered a deep, working-class solidarity that became incredibly important to the social fabric of the city. All right, Section 3, Gandhi and the Nationalist Movement. Let's move to the 20th century and see how this builds. Gandhi didn't just start out with massive nationwide strikes. His strategy grew organically. In 1917, he intervened in Champaran, demanding security of tenure and the freedom for peasants to grow crops of their choice. The very next year, in 1918, he tackled a labor dispute for mill workers in Ahmedabad, demanding better working conditions. By starting with these localized, very real struggles, he built the human foundation and trust needed to launch the massive non-cooperation movement in 1920. And just look at the sheer magnitude of the crowd in this photo. What this brilliantly illustrates is the transformation of Indian nationalism. It was no longer a debate restricted to elite intellectuals in closed rooms. It had become a mass movement of everyday people, peasants, workers, and artisans, stepping into the political arena to demand control over their own destiny and human rights. This brings us to Section 4, the tragedy of partition. To understand this tragedy, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is communalism? Human identity is wonderfully complex, you know? We're defined by our class, gender, profession, locality. But communalism arises in that specific moment when people begin to attach overriding absolute significance to one single aspect of their identity. In this historical case, religion. And sadly, this often happens at the exclusion or demonization of all other shared traits. The impacts of this communal fracture were truly devastating to millions of lives. Partition triggered an unprecedented mass migration. Literally millions were uprooted. The sources recount horrific gendered violence. Women were abducted, sold, or tragically killed by their own families in a twisted attempt to preserve honor. Communities that had lived side by side for centuries turned against one another. Yet, amidst this profound darkness, the sources also highlight incredible pockets of cross-community humanity. People like Dr. Sushila Nair bravely worked to provide medical help and foster harmony in the absolute worst of conditions. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Framing the Constitution. So, the crucial point is captured beautifully in this promise made during the Constitution Assembly debates. We are going to start a new chapter of independent India where there is equality of opportunity, where no one would be neglected. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a solemn, ambitious vow to end centuries of exploitation and legally ensure rights, dignity, and human development for every single citizen. But, as you can imagine, making that promise a reality meant navigating incredibly complex and conflicting visions. The Assembly had to debate fiercely, but collaboratively. Should rights belong primarily to the individual or to marginalized groups who needed special protection? How do you balance the centralized power of the union against the autonomy of the states to ensure economic progress without tyranny? And critically, how do you construct a secular framework to ensure a judicious distance between state and religion in order to heal those fresh communal wounds of partition? As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, thought-provoking question to ponder. How do these historical frameworks of rights, forged through the crucible of colonialism, mass struggle, and the tragedy of division, continue to shape human development today? History isn't just in the past, it's the very foundation of our present. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and keep questioning the world around you.
Thanks for watching. For daily APPSC Group 2 study material and updates, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon.